سلام دوستان، روزتون بخیر باشه. امروز یک برنامه خیلی جذاب داریم. یک شخصی به اسم جو کنت که رئیس سازمان ضد تروریستی آمریکا هست از ادامه جنگ با ایران صرف نظر کرده و استعفای خودشو نوشته و تحویل دولت ترامپ داده. و امروز آقای تاکر کارلسون که یکی از ژورنالیست های مطرح آمریکا هست و صاحب برنامه پربیننده ترین برنامه تاریخ آمریکا در شبکه فاکس نیوز آمریکا بوده و الان شبکه شخصی خودشو داره، کانال یوتیوب شخصی خودشو داره. امروز من تصمیم گرفتم که کل ویدیو جو کنت رو با ترجمهش ببینیم. من اینجا میشینم کنار صفحه و برنامه جو کنت رو پخش میکنم که با هم ادامهش رو ببینیم. کنارش هم عذرخواهی میکنم دیگه، من یه خورده غذا بخورم، ولی هر جای ویدیو که لازم باشه پاز میکنم، یه توضیحاتی شاید راجبش بدم. بزن بریم.
January of 2024. This is from this show, and this is Joe Kent, who later went on to become, until yesterday, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Here it is.
What do you think the immediate and then longer term effects of a war with Iran would be on the United States?
Immediately, it would be very bloody. I have no doubt that we could probably defeat some of their air defense and go in there and have another shock and awe campaign. But again, like we saw how the shock and awe campaign in Iraq really didn't actually work in the long run. So I have no doubt that we'd have some immediate results that people would cheer about here in the United States. But Iran, Persia has always been an empire. It's been around longer than any of the other players in the modern Middle East right now, and they are not going anywhere. If we get deeply involved and deeply entangled with Iran, we are playing right into China's hands, because China would like nothing more than for us to be committing our military industrial base to a war in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and then to be committing our conventional military power, our blood and our treasure, back in the Middle East. That will make the Pacific, our actual border, extremely vulnerable to Chinese aggression. Or China will simply just watch us bleed out economically as we bleed out on the battlefield on these couple different theaters. It's absolute insanity. It's opening up Pandora's box. And again, for what gain to the American people?
So, you're a YouTuber. You spend days scripting, weeks filming and editing. You finally upload, and then 53 views. Not because your content is bad, but because nobody clicked. On YouTube, no clicks equals no views.
ریسورس هاشو از دست بده، چون الان جنگ اوکراین هم هست. آمریکا اگر یه جنگ دیگه تو خاورمیانه شروع بکنه، باعث میشه که اون مهماتی که داره خرج جنگ ایران و جنگ اوکراین بشه و دیگه امنیت آمریکا رو نتونه در دریای چین و اون کره جنوبی و ژاپن امنیت آمریکا رو اونجا نتونن حفظ بکنن و خیلی آسیب پذیر میشن.
So the very first thing you notice about that clip, which was shot almost exactly a year before the current president was inaugurated, is that it was right. It was prescient. He called it. He called the general outline. Not that it was hard to call, but Joe Kent knows what he's talking about. He spent a lot of his life in that region, and he said, a year before this current presidency began, this is a big, serious country. It's the oldest civilization in the region, and if we went to war with Iran, there would be a momentary sugar high. Americans would support it because they support their own country, and they certainly support their military, and people would approve of it. But very quickly, you could see a process by which we got caught there, trapped there, bear trap. Hard to extricate yourself from that. And sitting on the sidelines would be our chief global competitor, China, who would be silently nodding along with a slowly spreading grin, knowing that they were the main beneficiary of what they were seeing, of our waste of American lives and treasure, as Joe Kent said. So we haven't reached that stage, thankfully. We're moving toward it, and everyone who's watching carefully knows that. And if you're honest, you know that. So this is a very serious moment we're in, and we're watching not just a war in Iran, but potentially a total realignment of the world and the loss, in some sense, of what the United States has globally. This could be the beginning of the end of our influence in a lot of the world, and that's just the beginning. So again, that's a big deal. It's starting to dawn on people, and that leaves Joe Kent as one of the relatively few people connected to this administration who said it in public. Is that good or bad? Well, it may seem good. Of course, you want to be around people who have clarity about what's going to happen next. But in practical terms, it's bad. In fact, it's always bad. Whenever you have somebody who stands up and says, don't do this, here's what could happen, and then you do it anyway, and it turns out that person was right, your first instinct is not to apologize and correct your behavior. Your first instinct is to crush the person who called it correctly. And that's your instinct because, and it's the lowest of all instincts, but it's a human instinct, that's your instinct because his correct prediction is an indictment of you, of course, and it's a way to deflect attacks on you and your own culpability by blaming the guy who told you it was going to happen before you did it. And this is a long-standing.
در واقع میدونید تاکر کارلسون چی میگه؟ تاکر کارلسون میگه که این شخص جو کنت سالها پیش به ما هشدار داد که ایران یک کشور قدرتمنده با اقتدار هست و مردمش به این سادگی زیر کشورش رو خالی نمی‌کنن. پس به این راحتی نیست که ما بریم یک حمله یکهویی به این کشور بکنیم و مردم اون کشور رو ما از بین ببریم، حکومتش رو عوض بکنیم و آمریکا مثلا عراق به اون کشور سلطه پیدا بکنه. جو کنت اینو سالها پیش به دولت آمریکا گفته بود، ولی الان دولت آمریکا به حرف جو کنت گوش نکرده. ایشون جو کنت یک شخص بسیار بزرگ هست، رئیس کل سازمان ضد تروریستی آمریکا است، یه شخص کمی نیست. این مورد رو به آمریکا، دولت‌های آمریکا اخطارش رو داده بود، ولی دولتی که فعلا روی کار هست تو آمریکا، ترامپ، اینو قبول نکرده بود و رفته بود جنگ رو شروع کرده بود. و الان که میبینیم الان روز 18 جنگ هست، امروز تاریخ چنه؟ تاریخ امروز 18 مارچ 2026 هست. روز 18-19 جنگ هست و همونطور که میبینیم نیروهای آمریکا در خاورمیانه کاملا منفجر شده و تمام تحلیلگر خارجی پیروزی رو تا الان با ایران میدونن. بریم ادامه ویدیو رو ببینیم.
Fact of human life, and in the last 60 years in this country, it has been the iron law of foreign policy, which is to say, when things go wrong, the only people who get punished are the people who criticize the adventure in the first place. You can imagine General Westmoreland attacking Walter Cronkite of CBS News, whatever you think of Walter Cronkite, in my case, not much. But fundamentally, it was Walter Cronkite sitting very much on the sidelines saying, hey, this war's not going well, and there was General Westmoreland prosecuting the war. But General Westmoreland argued till the end of his life, in some ways successfully, that he lost the war because Walter Cronkite criticized the war. Is that really true? How many troops did Walter Cronkite command? Was he in charge of strategy? Don't think so. He was a newsreader in New York. But you can see why Westmoreland did that, why a lot of people believed it, agreed with Westmoreland. You saw the same thing happen in the days after the tragic and incredibly stupid Afghan withdrawal under Joe Biden. That didn't help the United States. Of course, we had to get out of Afghanistan, but the way we did it, who would argue that was a good thing? It was a terrible thing and resulted in the deaths of a lot of Americans. So who was punished for that? As far as we can tell, and we've checked, only one person. And that would be Colonel Stu Scheller of the United States Marine Corps. What was his crime? Planning the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Oh, no. No, Stu Scheller's crime.
در واقع دوستان، تاکر کارلسون میگه که باید هر شخصی که تصمیمات بدی در دولت آمریکا داره میگیره باید تنبیه بشه و همینطور که جو کنت چنین اتفاقی رو پیش بینی کرده بود، باید ما به جو کنت اعتماد بکنیم و حرفشون رو قبول بکنیم و حرف اونایی که قبول نکردن رو حالا پانیشمنتشون کنیم.
was saying out loud, boy, that didn't work very well, and why'd we do this? And for that, he went to jail. The people who actually did it, who gave the orders, was saying out loud, boy, that didn't work very well, and why'd we do this? And for that, he went to jail. The people who actually did it, who gave the orders, or who carried them out without asking questions about them, which was everybody else, they're fine. You don't even know their names, and they certainly haven't been penalized. So there is a long history, because this is a standing feature of the way people are, that you criticize those who told the truth and who were right, who called it ahead of time. Now, in a functioning society, you get a hold of yourself and you understand that people are like this, but if you want to be successful as a society, you have to restrain that impulse because it's low and it's counterproductive. And if you silence people who tell the truth, you end up making the same mistakes again and again and again. And maybe that's why we're here at this pivotal point in our war with Iran. So that's the first thing you notice. Joe Kent was right, therefore Joe Kent must be destroyed. And there is, of course, this ongoing effort to do that, to dismiss Joe Kent as a tool of the Islamists or a leaker, or say he's married to someone who works for Hezbollah, or lie after lie after lie, but they're all aimed at Joe Kent the man, at his motives, at his character, at his personality. At his wife. And that's by design, because none of them touch on his reason for resigning as director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Because if you focused on that, you would have to answer his questions. You'd have to answer, is this true? Is what Joe Kent, who possessed highest level intelligence clearances, who was really barred from knowing no secret in the U.S. government since he was one of our top intelligence officials until yesterday, seems like a pretty informed guy. Is what he's saying true? That's the last conversation anyone in Washington wants to have, so just attack him.
در واقع میدونید تاکر کارلسون چی میگه؟ تاکر کارلسون میگه که چون این شخص جو کنت اطلاعات بسیار زیاد و گسترده‌ای داره، یعنی ترین راز آمریکا رو هم جو کنت میدونه، یعنی این شخص اینقدر ردش بالا بوده، امکان داره که مثلا این شخص رو از بین ببرن و اینکه همین دیگه ادامه‌شو ببینیم. اینو در لفافه داره میگه.
And you're going to see a lot more of that. The people who said this war was a bad idea will be punished. And the more it turns out they were right, which is to say the worse this project goes, the more it becomes obviously counterproductive to American interests, the more vigorously they will be punished, unto and including jail. Stu Scheller went to jail. Probably not the only one who will going forward. So you should just know that and understand what you're seeing in those terms. The second thing that comes immediately to mind when you watch Joe Kent from January of 2024 talk about what would happen if we went to war with Iran is that what he said that day, a year before Donald Trump's inauguration, could have been said by Donald Trump, maybe with a different style. He was making Donald Trump's case. The case that Donald Trump has made for a very long time. Donald Trump, as everybody knows, became the Republican nominee in 2016, 10 years ago, in part because he was the only Republican running for president that year out of a field of nearly 20 people who was willing to say what everyone else knew but was afraid to say, which is the Iraq War didn't help us. It hurt us. It was a dumb idea, and it went on way too long, and it became the quagmire that people like Donald Trump predicted it would be. And the American public, so relieved to hear the truth about something they already knew, made him the Republican nominee despite maybe some concerns. But they did it because, hey, he was right, and he's the only one brave enough to say so. And Donald Trump made varieties of that case for the next 10 years, and in many cases specifically about Iran, because Trump has seen, long before most people in Washington, before almost anyone in Washington, the big picture, the outline, which is this is a contest between the United States in the West and China in the East, a rising power that matches or maybe exceeds our economic power globally, and we have to figure out how to apportion power. And we don't want to get sidetracked with engagements like, I don't know, another endless Middle Eastern war, because in the end, the only winner of that conflict is China. Is China, in this specific case. Whoever in the end settles this conflict, whether it's the United States or some other power, whoever comes in at whatever the end of it is and says, enough, this is hurting the world, Each side has made its point, but the global economy has a critical interest in the Persian Gulf. That's energy. And we're going to stop this now. Whoever that person is will become more powerful than ever, and everyone else will become less powerful. The person who settles disputes is in charge. Not the person who starts them, not the person who wins them, the person who stops them. When dad comes home and stops the fighting between brother and sister, who's in charge? Dad, because he stopped the conflict. All of which is to say, if at the end of this conflict, it's China that comes in, China which has a vested interest in what happens in the region since they're a major consumer of Gulf energy, if it's China that comes in.
دوستان میدونید چی میگه؟ میگه که داره دنیا رو مثل یک خانواده تصور میکنه. میگه اگر که مثلا یک خواهر و برادر با هم دعواشون بشه، پدر میاد و اونا رو آشتی میده و اون پدر هست که حالا یه قربی توی خانواده میگیره، مسئولش میشه و مسئولیت قبول میکنه و ایشون از این بابت نگرانه که آمریکا اون سطح لول رو از دست بده و در آینده دیگه اون شخصی نباشه که برقرار کننده صلح در جهان باشه و چین جاشو بگیره. داره اینو تفسیر میکنه.
And restores the energy flows out of the Persian Gulf and restores some version of peace, gets the fighting to stop, then China is in charge of the Persian Gulf. That's just a fact of nature. And so a lot is at stake, as Joe Kent knew, as Donald Trump knew. And so the question is, how did Donald Trump, after 10 years of saying one thing, do in the pivotal act of his presidency exactly the opposite? That's not just an academic question. It's not the beginning of a conspiracy theory about some shadowy lobby. It's the most important question we face, because this is not the first time the United States has entered into this kind of war against the wishes of its own population and in clear contravention of its own interests, against its interests. This isn't good for us. No one has made the case that it's good for us. And increasingly, as the days pass, it becomes obvious to everyone why it's not good for us. And if you don't believe that, then check the prices of food and fuel and everything you buy, because everything you buy is dependent on the price of energy and the production of fertilizer, both of which are affected almost immediately by the closure of the Straits of Hormuz.
Build custom industrial machines.
So we did this again. It's not exactly clear how or why we did this, but we need to find out. And there is great resistance to finding out. And you've noticed that in the last 36 hours since Joe Kent resigned as director of the National Counterterrorism Center, one of our top intel officials, because the attacks on him have prevented an honest conversation about what he's actually saying. And what he's saying is, and he says it clearly, and we're going to ask him about it directly in just a moment, Israel got us into this war. Its lobby in the United States pressured the president, and its prime minister in Israel told the president, we're going without you. Join us, because if you don't, your troops in the region, your interests in the region, your citizens in the region will all be at risk. You have no choice. They led the way. That's Joe Kent's position. And rather than push back against that and say, no, actually he's wrong, they're telling you to shut up. And why are they doing that? Well, there's only one reason people ever become hysterical and slanderous, start screaming at you rather than answering you. It's because they're lying. And the truth is, this is not the first time you've watched people in charge lie. This has been going on a long time. And lies give way to a whole bunch of bad things. More lies. Once you tell a lie, you bolster it with further lying. Hysteria, the fear of being caught lying. The rage and slander. If the person catches me lying, he wins in the zero-sum game of lying. I die. You go on the attack to cover your lies. And bad judgment. You can't make wise decisions on the basis of lies because they're not true. They're not based in reality. That didn't actually happen. Or in this case, it did happen, but you're pretending it didn't. So a country based on lies, like a family based on lies, like an individual life based on lies, cannot succeed. In fact, it's hellish. As all of us have experienced.
دوستان میدونید چی میگه تاکر؟ تاکر کارلسون الان داره مسئله دروغ ترامپ رو میگه ترامپ سر این موضوع اومد رئیس جمهور ما شد که قرار شد دیگه جنگی صورت نگیره و فقط تمرکزشو بذاره روی خاورمیانه، تمرکزشو بذاره روی آمریکا نه روی خاورمیانه و جاهای دیگه دنیا. ترامپ از اون موقع تا حالا که تاکر کارلسون میگه ترامپ از اون موقع تا حالا که اومده رئیس جمهور شده هر حرفی زده دقیقاً برعکسشو انجام داده. میگه اگر جنگ نگفته بیشترین جنگ ها رو راه داده، یعنی به وجود آورده و حالا چیزای دیگه که با هم میبینیم.
Experienced in our lying. And so the only way out of this is to stop lying, is to tell the truth now, probably 63 years after we should have started telling the truth, but it's never too late to tell the truth now about everything. Because it's never as painful as you think it will be. It's actually an act of liberation. In fact, it's the only real act of liberation. Telling the truth sets you free because the truth itself sets you free. That is always and everywhere a fact. And the longer you delay doing that, the more horrible the consequences of your lies. So let's hope that tonight, with this conversation with Joe Ken, is the beginning of the long overdue truth-telling, which is the only thing that will save this country. And one final note about Joe Ken, who I spent the last 24 hours with. Joe Ken's resume hardly needs explanation because everyone is aware this is a man who deployed on 11 combat missions to the global war.
بچه‌ها جو کن یک شخص بسیار مهمه. نگاه اینقدر این شخص مهمه که من مو به تنم سیخ شده وقتی اسمش میاد و میخواد اینجا حرف بزنه. اینقدر این مصاحبه برای من ارزشمنده و دوستان باید حتما هممون گوشش بکنیم. منم دفعه اولمه دارم میبینمش و خیلی شوق زده هستم. یعنی اینقدر من شوق زده هستم که این مو به تنم سیخ شده. فقط خواستم اینو بهتون میگم که چقدر مهمه این موضوع. بریم.
War on terror. This is sort of the perfect representation of the GWAT generation. This is one of those guys we often celebrate but too rarely hear from, who we sent out to fight the so-called war on terror that began on 9/11. And it's an entire generation of men who look and sound, for the most part, very much like Joe Ken. So the implication, of course, he doesn't care about security or he's soft on Iran. Joe Ken spent, well, the majority of his 20s and 30s fighting Iranian proxies and watching his friends get killed by them. So this is someone who's actually earned the right to speak about Iran and the war on terror. And of course, he was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. So he's thought a lot about terrorism in this country and the blowback from events like this. And we're going to ask him about that as well. But the other thing to notice about Joe Ken, and it may be his defining factor, is that he doesn't slander anyone. His resignation letter was not an attack on Donald Trump. It wasn't a promise to write a tell-all memoir about what he saw on the inside or to aggrandize himself or to get a job on a TV show or sell something. I asked him at dinner last night, what are your plans? None. He did this purely because he believes, as he'll explain in a second, this is the only way to save the United States from certain disaster. Tell the truth. Air the secrets. Be honest for once in decades about what is actually happening. Things that everybody who lives here suspects are happening. In some cases, we're probably wrong. We've come to the wrong conclusions. That's okay. Tell us what actually happened. Tell us why you did this. And let's reorient this country where it should be, which is around its own citizens. Make the decisions that you make based on one criterion. Is this good for my people or not? In the way that a father would lead his family or an officer would lead his troops. It's not complicated. Everybody wants that. That's not a partisan question. That's a human question. And that's the question Joe Ken is posing. Why can't we do this? Why can't we say this? It's not attacking anybody. Joe Ken himself does not attack anybody. But this is a last-ditch attempt, not simply to save the country from disaster in Iran, but to save the country, period. And as you listen to him speak, ask yourself, is this a man who's working for Hezbollah or is an egomaniac or a leaker? Or is this a man who says very little?
دوستان من توضیح اینجا بدم. تاکر کارلسون این اولش داره توضیح میده. میگه این شخص اصلا وابسته به جایی نیست، توی مخفی ترین جای آمریکا کار میکرده، به حزب الله وابسته نیست، به دولت ایران وابسته نیست، به دولت چین وابسته نیست. داره اینا رو میگه که این شخص واقعا یک آمریکایی وطن پرسته و هر چی میگه باید به نفع آمریکا هست. یعنی هر چی میگه به نفع آمریکا هست و مثل بعضیا نیست که طرف یک گروه خاصی رو بگیره و مثلا با یه دید خاصی به مسائل نگاه کنه. ایشون با دید کاملا عادلانه به همه چیز نگاه میکنه. داره این مسئله توضیح میده الان.
Little when he has nothing to say, who speaks straightforwardly and with honesty, self-evident honesty.
Okay, great. Wait, were you even listening? You haven't taken a single...
Is this a man of dignity and decency? Is this a man that America once had a lot of? Is this a man who was once, in effect, the American archetype, the guy you looked up to, the guy you wanted your son to be? Whether you agree with him or not, maybe you're reaching completely different conclusions. But as you listen to him speak, ask yourself, is this the kind of person who makes me proud to be a fellow American? Because it's really a referendum on us. If we can't see that Joe Kent, whatever you think of his opinions, is the kind of man this country should be producing and should be elevating and should be proud of, if we can't see that, then we failed it.
در واقع میگه ما به افرادی مثل جو کنت در جامعهمون بیشتر نیاز داریم.
For joining us. So I appreciate this. So I want to go through the letter that you sent yesterday as you resigned as director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and basically through the big points and give you a chance to explain them. You've been spoken for quite a bit over the last 24 hours, so I think it'd be really helpful to all of us if you would speak for yourself and flesh out some of these points. I'm just going to read the first one. I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation. How did you reach that conclusion?
I think this is key. I mean, this would be more challenging to explain had the Secretary of State, the President, and the Speaker of the House not come out and said that we conducted this attack at this time because the Israelis were about to do so. So that takes away the argument that there was an imminent threat, as in Iran was planning to attack us immediately. That just simply did not exist.
May I ask you to pause? Sure. And so I've heard people say that, and this just happened, but history has a way of getting rewritten in real time, and then you look back 10 or 15, 20, 25 years later, and no one seems to understand the things that you saw because they've been eliminated. Yeah. So I think it's important to stop and say, here's what we actually know. So I'd like now, if we could, just to play one of the statements that you alluded to, and that's from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and this was shortly after this war commenced, and he was explaining, as this has happened, in a thoughtful, precise way, why. Here's Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
And so the president made the very wise decision. We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act.
Okay, so that is his almost contemporaneous explanation, and it's not offhand. He reasons it out. He explains there's a logic chain there, and he says, we knew not that Iran was going to attack. He did not say that.
Right.
He said we knew that Israel was going to attack Iran, and in retaliation for those attacks by Israel against Iran, Iran might attack American forces. So the imminent threat that the Secretary of State is describing is not from Iran, it's from Israel.
Exactly. And I think this speaks to the broader issue. Who is in charge of our policy in the Middle East? Who is in charge of when we decide to go to war or not? In this case, with what the Secretary described, and later on the President, later on the Speaker of the House, and the way the events played out, the Israelis drove the decision to take this action, which we knew would set off a series of events, meaning the Iranians would retaliate. Now, I think there's a potential there where we could have done several different things. We could have simply said to the Israelis, no, you will not. And if you do, then we will take something away from you. I think that it's fine that we offer defense to Israel, but when we're providing the means for their defense, we get to dictate the terms of when they go on the offensive. Otherwise, they stand to lose that relationship. And the Israelis felt emboldened that no matter what they did, no matter what situation they put us in, that they could go ahead and take this action, and we would just have to react. And so that speaks to that relationship. But also, it just shows that there was a lobby pushing for us to go to war. I know we'll get into that later on in the statement, but we had a real potential, I think, knowing what we know of the Iranians and how they react, and in particular, how they react to President Trump's leadership. The Iranians, under President Trump's leadership, especially in his second term, they have shown that they take a very calculated approach to the escalation ladder. For instance, in the lead up to the 12-day war before Midnight Hammer, the Iranians didn't attack us. They were engaged in negotiations with us. When President Trump came back into office, they stopped their proxies who were attacking us under the Biden administration because they knew Biden was weak. They stopped their proxies from attacking us as well. So they knew President Trump was someone who wanted to negotiate, but more importantly, they knew that President Trump was not someone to mess with because he killed Qasem Soleimani, he killed Abu Mahdi Mohandas, he had defeated ISIS. They knew that President Trump was a man of action. He is militarily strong, and so they said, before we take an action, we need to make sure that it's calculated. So I think in this scenario, even if the Israelis told us, we're going to strike on this date at this time, and we didn't, try to negotiate with the Israelis and say, hey, we'll take something away from them. I think we still could have back-channeled to the Iranians and said, hey, if something happens here in the next couple of days, it's not us. We're still serious about negotiations, and we don't want to escalate this, because it's well known what the Iranians' plans were. We knew that they were going to hit potentially our bases in the region, potentially our allies. We knew about the Straits of Hormuz. All of these things, I think, were fairly well known.
And the Houthis' ability to close the Red Sea, which they've not yet done, but which would be catastrophic.
میدونین دوستان در واقع چی میگه؟ در واقع اینا جفتشون از این ناراحت هستن که میگن افسار آمریکا دست یک دولت دیگه هست. و شما فرض بکن حالا ما ایرانی هستیم، میریم توی مجلس، دیدین که چقدر حس بد میگیریم راجع به کمک به مثلا حالا پولامونو میفرستن فلان کشور خرج میکنن. دقیقاً همین حسی رو ما تجربه کردیم که الان اینا دارن تجربه میکنن. میگن چرا مثلا یه نفر دیگه کشور دیگه برامون تصمیم میگیره، پولامون داره یه جای دیگه خرج میشه. صحبت بحث اینه.
Yes. To the world. Everybody knows somebody who has had an unexpected tragedy. You lose a parent, a spouse, and that person to ads of the ones who apply. And you people insurance help.com. High profile resignation application times and rates may vary, but they're good. So, but for the purpose of explaining your position or fleshing it out more so people can understand it, because you're the most high profile resignation by far in a long time. And there's a lot of commentary on this. And I took a quick trip through it this afternoon. And one of the consistent themes as well, I mean, of course, there's a lot of slander, which we can talk about. But the substantive attack on you, and it is an attack or refutation of your letter, is that, well, actually, Joe Kent was totally for using military action. He supported the Soleimani.
The PC MasterCard doesn't limit how much you can get back. No matter what.
Killing, for example. He seemed fine with the 12-day war, for example. So he doesn't have a problem on principle with an engagement with Iran. You're saying what to that? What's your response?
Well, I have no compunction about really fighting anybody who threatens our country, and the Iranians have posed a threat in the past, and the Iranians have a way of threatening America. They have the capability, and we always talk in the intelligence circles about capability and intent, what your enemy is capable of doing and what they actually want to do. And again, back to the data that we have on the Iranians, they used the escalation ladder. We saw that deliberately during the 12-day war. When they struck back after Midnight Hammer, it was very deliberate. They fired an equal amount of missiles as we dropped bombs on the nuclear facilities, and they basically hit a part of a base in Qatar that they knew we didn't have any troops on.
Yes.
They didn't want to escalate any further than we were willing to go. But also, the Iranians, when they pose a threat to us, they usually do it with their proxies. And if their proxies stick their heads up and their proxies come after us, this is basically the Trump doctrine, we hammer them and we hammer their high-profile leaders. Qasem Soleimani was highly effective and highly revered in Iran because the previous presidents, prior to President Trump, Obama and Bush, let Qasem Soleimani run around, raise proxy armies, kill Americans, and no one ever did anything to him. President Trump rightfully killed Qasem Soleimani. We got his deputy, Abu Mahdi Mohandes, who had American blood on his hands, took them off the battlefield. But then President Trump stopped. He took those two key players off the battlefield, and he said, I'm not going to further escalate with Iran unless you escalate with us, knowing that if we struck Iran and we truly struck the regime, that would only strengthen the regime. So then President Trump did something that's incredibly smart, use that decisive military action, but then he coupled it with an economic package of sanctions, maximum pressure sanctions. And we can debate whether or not we should be using sanctions as the prime reserve currency holder or whatever, but he pressured the Iranians economically. After punching them in the mouth and showing that, hey, I won't take this, I'm not Obama, I'm not Bush, if you cross a line, I will come after you. But then he really put the pressure on them economically. And if you look at the effect of the economic sanctions, that's what got the Iranian people on the streets actually protesting against the Ayatollah's government, which is ostensibly what we would like. We would like to see a bottom-up regime change.
خب دوستان اینجا یه چند تا توضیحات من بدم. ایشون میگه که من ابایی ندارم که هر شخصی که یک یک خطر برای آمریکا باشه رو از سر راه بردارن، همونطور که مثلا قاسم سلیمانی رو برش داشتیم، همونطور که حالا اون پراکسی‌های ایران رو توی منطقه تونستن بردارن. و نکته بعدیش اینه که میگه ایران خیلی حساب شده به ما پاسخ میداد، یعنی حساب میکرد چون که مثلا ترامپ یک مرد رزمی بود و حتما هر کاری که میگفت انجام میداد، ایران هم خیلی حساب شده جواب میداد. حتی تعداد موشکایی هم که شلیک کرده بودیم روی سر نیرو هسته ایران، همون تعداد موشک رو به ما شلیک کردن. بعد نکته بعدیشو
where we get rid of the Ayatollah, but it's the will of the people.
نکته بعدیش راجع به تحریم های ایران میگه توی دولت ترامپ تنها دولتی بود که تحریم‌هایی رو روی ایران گذاشتیم که تونستیم مردم ایران رو بالاخره به خیابون‌ها بکشونیم. توی دولت قبلی تحریم بوده، ولی دولت ترامپ جدیداً تحریم‌ها به صورتی خیلی خیلی سنگین و عملگرا بوده که تونستیم مردم رو به خیابون بکشونیم و اون اعتراضات رو شکلش بدیم.
And they have a new successful government that's stable that we can deal with. The one way to throw that all out the window, and this isn't just Joe Kent's opinion, many scholars, and I think a lot of intelligence assessments have been written about this too, I know for a fact they have, is that if we struck the regime, it would only strengthen it. And that's not, I think that's just basic common sense. I mean, I think of myself, and probably you're in this camp as well, we didn't like Joe Biden, we didn't like Barack Obama, but if an outside force were to come in here and try and topple them while they were the president, I would 100% rally around the flag. That's just common sense. So if we wanted to strengthen,
well, you actually did. You just joined the military under Bill Clinton, whom I assume you didn't vote for.
Right.
Right. You joined in 1998. You've run the whole cycle of the war on terror, I notice, and served out as an NCO. I think your entire
NCO warrant officer.
Yeah, warrant officer, 20 years. And I should just say, I hate ever to refer to a man's resume as like a data point because your ideas exist separately. But in this specific case, meaning you spend most of your time fighting Iranian proxies.
Yeah, a good deal of it, yeah.
Yeah. So you're aware of the threat from Iran. You have personally used violence against that threat.
I have.
Yeah. A lot of it, I think. And you supported the president's policy up until fairly recently.
Right.
And you've said that a lot in public. In fact, you went to work for him. He hired you.
Yeah.
Right. But here's from what I can tell, is the central question. Imminent threat. Now, the president has said many times to many people, including the public, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he must have said that to you. You don't have to say it. But he said it to everybody. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. They can't have a nuke. Whenever asked, we say, let's just start here. They can't have a nuke. Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. Everyone agreed with that conceptually. Was Iran on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon?
No, they weren't, 3 weeks ago when this started, and they weren't in June either. I mean, the Iranians have had a religious ruling, a fatwa, against actually developing a nuclear weapon since 2004. That's been in place since 2004. That's available in the public sphere. But then also we had no intelligence to indicate that fatwa was being disobeyed or it was on the cusp of being lifted. The Iranian strategy, it's actually pretty pragmatic. The Iranians are obviously aware of what's taking place in their region. And their strategy was to not completely abandon their nuclear program because they saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya when he said, hey, I've got no more nukes. I'll do what you say. I'll give up my nukes.
And we gave him the Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, we regime changed him and he was executed by his own people in the most horrific way.
Oh, sodomized by a bayonet. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the lesson, I think, that the entire region took from that when Hillary Clinton.
Unfortunately, that is what the neocon, neoliberal warmongers, that's the lesson that they showed everyone in the region. And then conversely, the Iranians also knew that if they came out and said, okay, we've got a nuke, whether they were bluffing or not, Saddam Hussein, Iraq right next door. So they kind of had
this. And he hung, I think.
He was hung by his own people, after a bloody, war that's still essentially going on inside of Iraq. So the Iranians' position, when viewed from the lens of the region, was actually fairly pragmatic. They were preventing, themselves from developing a bomb, but they still wanted the ability. They wanted the ability to enrich. They wanted the ability to have some components so that they weren't completely stripped of it. And when we always assessed that they were either several months or a year, 2 years away from actually being able to develop a nuclear weapon. And that's not because the Iranians are stupid people. I think we can tell right now that the Iranians are anything but stupid. They had the ability, I think, that the brain power to actually develop one, or they could have simply traded a ton of oil with Pakistan or someone else to actually get a nuclear weapon. They were not doing that. We had no intelligence to indicate that they were.
هر موقع میگه ایرانیا باهوش هستن حس خیلی خوبی میگیرم.
Then why was the president, was he told that they were on the brink of it? Why at the beginning of every conversation about Iran would the president say, I don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Why was that the central question when, and you would know since you were the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, why would he say that if there was no intelligence or evidence that they were actually developing a nuke?
So, I mean, a couple things. This is what I talk about in the letter about this ecosystem of information that's laundered through a lot of prominent neoconservative types that are very sympathetic to the Israeli cause, and then also Israeli government officials who give us things in semi-official channels. What they did was they created basically a shifting red line or a new red line. So if the president's red line was Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, we've actually got a lot of trade space in there for a deal to be made. Because of what I just described with the Iranian policy. Essentially, the Iranians saying, okay, well, we don't want a nuclear weapon. Well, that means we basically are at a point where we can start negotiating and we can come up with a deal. And the president is a fantastic deal maker. So if your goal is to move us away from any kind of deal and your goal is to move us into a conflict, you have to shift that red line. And that's where a lot of this I would say what became a de facto U.S. policy of Iran can have no nuclear enrichment. It was laundered through a lot of the different talking heads, Mark Levin, Mark Dubowitz, you've got the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, you name it. Washington, D.C. has plenty of pro-Israeli lobbyists who will come and say those things, who will publish think pieces on it, who will go on the media, who will run op-eds in the Wall Street Journal to talk about this, why they can't have any enrichment whatsoever. And then we have a high degree of engagement with Israeli government officials who will come in and say, well, they're enriching and they could enrich or they could enrich more, and that will get them closer to a nuclear weapon. So then enrichment basically became the new U.S. policy. And the only official I've heard, and folks are welcome to look for this, that said this in the first Trump administration was Mike Pompeo. He said it. The president didn't say it. The president has been very consistent. He said they can't have a nuclear weapon. But again, like I said, that puts us at a place where we actually could have negotiations. And only President Trump, I think, could successfully have negotiations with Iran because he actually punched them in the face. And the Iranians had been walking all over us. They had been killing our soldiers. All of that is true. I have no sympathy whatsoever for the Iranians, what their proxies were doing. President Trump level set that when he killed Qasem Soleimani and he killed Abu Mahdi Mohandas. The folks who wanted to push an actual regime change war in Iran knew this, and they knew there was a potential to get a deal, or there was a potential for President Trump just to continue the policy of maximum pressure sanctions, and if you come after us, we will hit you hard. And that got the protesters out on the street in Iran, and that's actually what the regime feared the most. I don't think the Ayatollah feared dying, not because he, is some crazy lunatic. I'm sure some degree of the Shia martyrdom culture played a factor in that. However, I think he knew that if he was killed, the regime would survive because the people would rally around the regime.
Well, there's been a lot of noise in the news lately, but none of it matters if you can't hear it. And there's no shame in that. And Dr. Wall Green or squint into other HE more and has now predicted this, some years ago. I think we're systems should have done all along. I believe you predicted this, some years ago. I think we're watching. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what we're watching, but it seems consistent with what we are watching. So I'm just focused on this question of imminent threat because that's really the only justification I think most Americans would accept for a preemptive war.
Certainly.
Otherwise, just like a war of choice done because Bibi told you to, and no one wants to get behind that because it's obviously illegitimate. So imminent threat, you're saying that there was no intelligence that you saw with the highest level clearance, obviously involved in this conversation, that showed an imminent threat from Iran to the United States? No,
unless we took certain actions, unless we came after them in a way that they thought threatened the regime. Then we basically knew what they were going to do.
Well, okay, right, of course.
Right, but like any country. So if you attack any country, we know that they're going to have a reaction.
We face an imminent threat once we attack you.
Yeah, exactly. But there was no intelligence that said, hey, on whatever day it was, March 1st, the Iranians are going to launch this big sneak attack. They're going to do some kind of a 9/11 Pearl Harbor, et cetera. They're going to attack one of our bases. There was none of that intelligence. Again, back to what we know about the Iranians, they're very, very deliberate with the escalation ladder. And again, they're only deliberate under President Trump's leadership because they knew and they took President Trump very, very seriously.
So, I mean, I just think it's a remarkable thing to nail down because you're not some guy on Twitter. You're a senior, as of yesterday, you were a senior U.S. Intelligence official who's not hostile to President Trump, who's not going to here to write a tell-all book or launch a media career. So I think you're a sober voice on this. And just to be clear, there was no intelligence that showed imminent threat. There was no intelligence that showed they were on the cusp of building a nuclear weapon. There was no intelligence, indeed, that showed they were trying to build a nuclear weapon. And nobody said, I've seen it, but you haven't. It exists, but you just haven't seen it. Did you ever hear anybody say there is intel that shows this?
I did not know, but I know how this works. I know the Israeli officials, some in intelligence, some in government, will come to U.S. government officials, and they will say all kinds of things that we know from our intelligence just simply isn't true. And they'll say, hey, I'm giving you a preview. It's not in intelligence channels yet, but here's what's going to happen. And that doesn't usually come to
Wait a second. I mean, I thought that U.S. policymakers made their decisions on the basis of intelligence collected and or vetted by our intelligence. That's why we have intelligence agencies that soak up hundreds of billions a year. But you're saying that Israeli officials short-circuited the entire U.S. government and just went right to American policymakers and said, it doesn't matter what your country says, here's what we know. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, usually they're pretty slick, and
of course.
And they'll say, hey, this isn't in intelligence channels yet because it's going to take some time to get there. And here they're on the cusp of building a bomb. You know, they're going to, I don't know, you pick your topic. A lot of times they'll sample different things until they find what sticks. But in general, the narrative about, you know, they're going to do a preemptive attack, or really just they're going to build a nuclear weapon. And if we don't stop them now, they're going to build a nuclear weapon. And enrichment is the pathway to that. They're going to continue enriching at whatever percent. Enrichment became the narrative. And so that hung up and that short-circuited and really sabotaged the entire negotiations, because the Iranians basically said, like, we're not going to negotiate if the whole starting point is no enrichment. And again, that had nothing to do with a nuclear weapon, and the Iranians essentially agreed to that. So the Israelis came in, they moved that red line, and they would do a lot to say, like, oh, they're in.
میدونین دوستان چی میگه؟ در واقع میگه که ایرانی ها دوست داشتن که با ما نگوشییت بکنن و هیچ خطری هم برای آمریکا نداشتن، بر اساس سیستم اطلاعاتی آمریکا که ایشون رئیسشه، همین ایشون که داره حرف میزنه ایشون رئیسش بوده، رئیس تمام اطلاعات آمریکا. میگه هیچ گونه اطلاعاتی ما نداریم که نشون بده ایران سلاح هسته‌ای میخواسته بسازه یا حمله بکنه به ما. ولی گهگاهی اسرائیلیا می اومدن به ما میگفتن که آره ایران، ما بر اساس سیستم اطلاعاتی خودمون اینجا اینو کشف کردیم و بر اساس این شما برین جلو، شما اطلاعاتتون کامل نیست، اطلاعات ما کامله. و یه جورایی این آمریکایی‌ها بعدشون می اومده از این حرکت، از چهرهشون مشخصه، من خوندم.
Enriching, and you know what that means? That means in X amount of time they could have a nuclear bomb. You have to ask now. And then the way the ecosystem would work is that the talking heads on TV, you know, your Mark Levin's, Sean Hannity's, etc., they would say basically the exact same thing that night on TV, or there would be a piece written in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, that would say something very, very similar. Yet, if you looked in classified intelligence, we didn't see any of that.
I mean, that must have been such a weird experience for you.
Bizarre.
Since you have access to the biggest and most powerful and presumably the best intel agencies in the world, and you're seeing people say things as fact when you know that they're not facts.
Right.
What was that like?
Infuriating. And I think that's why, in general, in the lead up to this last iteration, a good deal of key decision makers were not allowed to come express their opinion to the president.
میدونی دوستان چی میگه؟ میگه شما تاکر کارلسون ازش میپرسه تو حس بد بهت نمیده که مثلا یه کشور دیگه میاد به کشور شما میگه که بر اساس اطلاعات ما این درسته؟ آدم میگه آره من خیلی سرخورده میشدم و حتی بعضی موقع به ما اجازه نمیدادن که نظر خودمون رو بیان بکنیم. اون یعنی اینقدر سوار افکار و نظرات ما میشدن.
Not allowed by whom?
I think it's important for me right now just to stay on the facts. I don't want to point names. I don't want this to become a name calling or this guy did this on this day.
But any leader has gatekeepers, and so you're saying that you were prevented from bringing this information directly to the president by gatekeepers.
Well, there wasn't a robust debate. So in general, because our assessment really hadn't changed, we would send those up through intelligence channels. Everybody's kind of reading the same intelligence, but then what actually gets briefed to the president can be very, very different depending on who and how it's delivered. And without a level set from the intelligence community, someone like D&I Gabbard coming in and saying, Mr. President, like, here's the full scope of the intelligence and what it means, you're kind of lacking that sanity check of where we're at, or at least a good sampling, to gauge how accurate what the Israelis are saying is. And that process.
میدونی دوستان چی میگه؟ میگه بعضی موقع حتی یه سری اطلاعات رو به ما میگفتن که به رئیس جمهور نگیم و به جاش یه اطلاعات دیگه به ما میدادن که به رئیس جمهور بگیم. منظورش همون کشور هست. این خیلی خیلی مهمه ها دوستان، این نکته که گفتا. اینو یه بار دیگه ببینیمش بعداً.
process, in my view, was largely stifled in this second iteration. There was robust debate and robust discussions leading up to the 12-day war into Midnight Hammer. But this second round, to me, and I'm sure others will refute this and disagree with me, but what was conducted by just a handful of small of advisors around the president.
That is true. I believe what you're saying is true. My sense, though, and you would know more than I, is there weren't a lot of people directly around the president who work there, who work at the White House, his, the principals, who are making an aggressive case for this war. Do you think there was, was
دوستان من یعنی خیلی به دلم به حال اینا داره میسوزه، یعنی اینقدر اینا دارن اون کشور داره سوار آمریکایی‌ها میشن. خیلی خیلی توی چهره این آدمه غم هست دوستان، یعنی غمی که فرض کن یکی افسارتو داره، با افسارش شما رو داره کنترل میکنه. همون راجع به عملیات میدنایت همر هم داره میگه ما اون اطلاعاتی که ما دادیم و هیچ کدومشو قبول نکردن و اون اطلاعاتی که خودشون داشتن و بردن جلو و یه سری مشاور خاص داشتن که این اطلاعات رو بهش دادن و اون عملیات انجام دادن.
Was there a majority of like his top 10 advisors who were saying we must do this now?
I think the circle that was around him was very, very tight and very small, and I think they were all on the same sheet of music. And I think a lot of them were getting their information from the ecosystem that I described. And I think we'd be in a different place if we would have talked about what the intelligence picture is and what our interest is.
So Israeli government talking points laundered through Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, is that the ecosystem you're talking about?
Yeah, and then the Israeli officials coming in and basically either ahead of time or after the fact saying the same thing, like the enrichment is going to get them a nuclear bomb in set amount of time.
Do you believe that you and
میگه عموما تمام اخباری که توی فاکس نیوز میاد همین اخباری هست که اسرائیلیا میخوان به جامعه آمریکا تزریق بکنن و یه سری حرفای این مدلی میزنه که اون حالا بقیه‌اش خودتون بدونه.
And the DNI for whom you worked until yesterday had as much FaceTime with the president as Israeli officials did?
I don't know. I don't know that for sure because I don't know exactly how frequently the Israelis were engaging directly with the president. It did seem like Benjamin Netanyahu was, obviously that was all public, that he was in the White House.
7 times.
Quite a bit, yeah, quite a bit. And then his other officials as well, Dermer, et cetera, those guys were in, they were making phone calls, just a lot of engagement from them. And again, when we would hear, or you'd hear what they were saying, it didn't reflect in intelligence channels, even intelligence that we shared with the Israelis that the Israelis were giving us in many cases. So there was a clear, gap between, the intelligence and then the information that the president was given and the decisions that the president was making.
I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position. Obviously, you're not going to divulge anything that's classified. I don't think you would. You definitely shouldn't, because there are people who hurt you for that, and you shouldn't. So without encouraging you to do that, I think it's a commonplace. It's understood in Washington. I've heard from many people who work in your business that a substantial portion of our information touches Israel at some point. Either it's collected by them, it is shaped by them. It's not purely American. Do you think it's fair?
Especially in the Middle East, I would say. I mean, look, the Israelis are tactically very proficient.
Yes.
They have a very competent intelligence service. And there's a lot that we can learn from them in the craft of intelligence.
Yes.
So they're very proficient. They're very good. However, whenever we get information from a liaison service, I think it's incredibly important to realize that it could be given to us to influence us as well as to inform us. And the way that I would see Israeli information, in particular coming from senior officials directly to our senior officials, that caveat just wasn't given frequently enough. And there's a lot of times, some of this is just because of bureaucratic practice, but a lot of it I think is just we feel very comfortable with the Israelis. A lot of them are dual citizens. They sound like us. They don't feel foreign. We kind of go into a more complacent mode where we trust a lot of what they have to say, not keeping in the back of our mind that they have their own agenda and we have our own agenda at the end of the day. Now, I'd say a lot of times we have the same agenda. It's very, very, I think, tactically the same when it comes to fighting Hezbollah, when it comes to fighting terrorism, sure. But when it comes to what's our strategic goal in a war that's going to have ramifications for our nation, for the region, for global energy supplies, I think most folks right now at the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies, they would say us and the Israelis actually have a different objective here. I don't believe that our objective has been clearly defined because we're shying away from regime change. The Israelis are not shying away from regime change. They want to knock out lock, stock, and barrel the current government. They don't seem to have a plan for what comes next.
Well, that was my next question. And I think you would have heard tell of such a plan. So if you're going to take out a government, I think it's fair to
میدونید دوستان چی میگه هدف آمریکا تغییر رژیم ایران نیست و نبوده. تغییر رژیم فقط هدف همون کشوره بوده و اون کشور هم هنوز نمیدونه بعد از اینکه این رژیم فعلی سقوط کرد چه رژیمی قرار بیاد. فقط میخوان که این نباشه.
to ask what replaces it. And I have asked a bunch of people, many people, this question, never gotten any answer whatsoever other than there's no plan. The Israelis don't have a plan because they don't care. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's completely fair. I think as Americans, rightfully, we want a clear stated objective and end state for war. I think that's something that was born out of the GWAT, was born out of the Vietnam era. Americans want to know why we're going to war and what the end state is. And they can get on board in general if that's clearly articulated. That's not the case with Iran. The Israelis are different. I think a lot of times, again, because a lot of them speak English, they culturally feel the same, but the Israelis have a much different tolerance for how and why they're going to war and for their endurance for war. The Israelis are completely fine with Iran slipping into chaos. That means that the Ayatollah and the IRGC can't really threaten them anymore. Hezbollah's money might be cut off in their head. And so complete chaos in Iran, it's not necessarily a bad thing for the Israelis. For us, for global energy, Straits of Hormuz, our partners in the GCC, mass migration problems in Europe, this is a major problem.
It's a catastrophe for the world.
For the world, yeah.
Hate to brag, but we're pretty confident this show is the most vehemently pro.
میدونین دوستان چی میگه برای اسرائیل اصلاً مهم نیست که تو ایران چه اتفاقی میفته. فقط میخوان که یه حکومت اونجا نباشه که کشور رو قوی بکنه. برای آمریکا خیلی مهمه چون سلامت مردم مهمه، سلامت انرژی دنیا مهمه، تنگی هرمز رو باز بذارن مهمه و مردم مهاجرت نکنن به کشور اطراف خیلی مهمه.
Would you like to receive a gift? I'm a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day
Care anytime, no matter where you are. Exclusive Dutch limited in a learn more yet.
Lectures for a couple of weeks about, the valiant people of Iran and how we needed to save them. And then a lot of the exile communities here in the United States of Iranians, a lot of them really nice people, sure. They jumped on board. We got to save our people. But by your telling and by the facts, by the way, this is not really an opinion. There's no plan for what happens after regime change. Like the people pushing that line would be happy to see a permanent civil war there.
Which is insanity. So if we do want a real regime change and we want the people to rise up, we want it to happen fairly organically, going aggressively after the Ayatollah was the last thing that we ever should have done. Again, I'm no fan of the former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. However, he was moderating their nuclear program. He was preventing them from getting a nuclear weapon. If you take him out, if you kill him aggressively, people are going to rally around that regime. And the next Ayatollah that you get, and I think this is the case by all data that we have with his son, the next Ayatollah that you get is going to be more radical because he has to show the people that he's going to push back. And there's always a tension inside of Iran between the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the clerics who run the country. They have a healthy, I think, tension between the two, a rivalry. IRGC's leadership, these are Qasem Soleimani's troops. These are the guys that Soleimani trained. These guys, most of them cut their teeth in the Iraq-Iran war. A lot of them cut their teeth fighting us in Iraq. They cut their teeth fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They created Hezbollah. They trained and armed Hezbollah. So these guys are actually pretty serious and pretty hardline, and they're willing to fight and they want to fight. And so by killing the Ayatollah, we've given them more power because now internally they can go and they can say, hey, all you guys who thought that we could negotiate with the Americans, you're chumps. We have to fight them. So I think the longer this goes on, the more negotiators, the more moderates that are killed off. Like we just killed, Ali Laranjani, who was a negotiator, who was eager to get us a deal. Again, look, I've got no love for the IRGC. I've got no love for the Iranians. But you've got to realize,
just to be clear,
if you want it to end,
in case you're tuning in now, you fought their proxies.
I fought their proxies. I mean, I put countless of them in flex cuffs or much worse. I've gone after the Iranians. I was in specialized outfits that went after the Iranians and their proxies. These are very serious people. They're not supermen by any means. They're humans, but they're serious. And if you give the IRGC a reason to take more control and they get support from the people, because again, you kill off the Ayatollah, they can say, hey, the last guy was too moderate. Look at what it got us. Like, give us more control.
I get it.
And the Iranian people are going to be like, well, actually, yeah, I don't like getting bombed by the Americans and the Israelis. Maybe we do need to listen to the IRGC.
So a lot of these, the points that you're making, I think are insightful, but they're also pretty obvious.
دوستان الان در واقع چی میگیم؟ در واقع داره میگه که توی ایران خب ما اصولگرا داریم، اصلاح طلب. اصولگرا همون مثلا سپاهیا هستن و اینا، و اصلاح طلبها همونایی بودن که میگفتن بریم با اون دولت آمریکا مصاحبه بکنیم، نگوشیت بکنیم و اینا. ولی دیدن وقتی ما رفتیم مثلا مصاحبه کردیم، نگوشیت کردیم با آمریکا، وسط مثلا نگوشیت کردن اومدن به ما حمله کردن و الان اون سپاهیا اون عقب نشستن و به اصلاح طلبها دارن میگن که دیدین با آمریکا نمیشه مذاکره کرد و وسط مذاکره ما رو زدن. پس حالا بیا این دفعه به حرف ما گوش بدیم. الان ترس این جوکنت از اینه که کشور بیشتر سمت سپاهیا بره و مردم حرف سپاهیا رو بیشتر گوش بدن تا اصلاح طلبها. بریم بقیه‌شو ببینیم.
Obvious if you kind of game it out for 10 seconds. So it seems like you've got two different goals. You've described Israel's goal as just regime change, permanent chaos, take Iran off the map as a coherent nation state, just tie them up with internal chaos. Whatever the effects of that are on the rest of the world, all of them disastrous. Then on the American side, you have the president's stated goal, which is we can't let Iran have a nuclear weapon, which they didn't have and weren't trying to build in any imminent way.
Right.
Okay. So if you join those two together in a common mission in a war, like that's our partner in this war, then you create all kinds of very bad incentives. And now Larijani, I think, was killed by the Israelis. You saw the Israelis blow up Qatari natural gas facilities today in the Qatari natural gas field, which feeds the rest of the world LNG. Those seem like very obvious steps, not to minimize the threat from Iran, but to lock down the United States in perma-war. We can't get out after we do that. You kill the negotiator. You attack our closest ally in the region, is probably Qatar. You attack Qatar, apparently? Like, no one thought this might happen?
And there's no reins on the Israelis, unfortunately. I mean, we continue to refer to them like as our partners or equal to the best partners we've ever had. But at the end of the day, the Israelis couldn't do any of this without us. And so we have to be
acting against our interests in a very obvious and very serious way.
And again, it's obvious if we've stated that our goal is just to take away their ability to ever even enrich and to take away their ballistics and to take away their navy, all these kind of tactical objectives. If we say that that's our objective, and that's when we can come to a place where we can just exit, it's in the Israelis' interest to get us more and more entrenched in this.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what they're doing right now. You know, I when the Israelis killed Larijani, I think I may have misspoke and said we didn't kill him. The Israelis struck him. But I do believe in Iran at this point of the war, they view it as, whether we like it or not, I think they view it as us and the Israelis kind of as the same thing.
We've described it that way.
Because the Israelis couldn't do any of this without us. And that's where the relationship is just way off kilter. If they have different objectives than us, then what are we doing letting them drive the war?
So you just said something that's been disputed many times by the well, I'm not going to name anybody, but by...
یه نکته اینجا هست دوستان من بگم. آمریکایی‌ها و اسرائیلیا توی جنگ شاید در ظاهر یکی به نظر بیان، ولی اون چیزی که الان ما داریم از این رئیس سازمان اطلاعات آمریکا میشنویم اینجوریه که آمریکا خیلی موضع پر احتیاط تری رو داره و این اون کشوره هست که داره پای آمریکا رو هی میکشه وسط که پاشو گیر بندازه. گفت که با حمله به لاریجانی این احتمال که جنگ پایان بیاور رو از بین بردن. چرا که لاریجانی اون شخصی بود که با آمریکا مذاکره میکرد. امروز هم که منابع گاز عسلویه ایران رو زدن که اینم همون باعث میشه که آمریکا اونجا میخکوب بشه و به جنگ کردنش ادامه بده. در واقع اون کشور میخواد آمریکا اینجا بمونه و جنگ کنه با ایران. هر کاری میکنه، تمام کاری که میکنه موندن آمریکا رو اونجا تضمین میکنه و این آمریکایی‌ها که دارن اینجا صحبت میکنن، هم تاکر کارلسون همون یکیه، اینو دارن به ما دارن میگن که این اهداف آمریکا نبوده.
Advocates for Israel, it's a PR department here in the United States, which is huge. And you said they couldn't do any of this without us. You often hear its promoters, its lobbyists say, Israel just wants to fight its own wars. Back off and let us do it. Is that not?
I'd love us to run the experiment. We try that.
What would happen?
You know, the Israelis, again, they have the ability to go out and collect great intelligence. They have a very capable military, but they're a very small country. I think Israel would be able to defend itself. I think it could conduct, limited strikes on its borders. I think it could continue carrying out pretty impressive targeted assassinations against its adversaries. And so I think you would see it relatively contained. What it couldn't do is go topple entire governments. It couldn't do something like the Iran war, the Iraq war. It couldn't aggressively, destabilize Syria. These big, heavy lifts of regime change that America has been engaged in, Israel could not do on their own, which is where you get back to the Israeli lobby being just so potent and so powerful and so aggressive.
So that, and I want to ask you about that because that's the line that you're being attacked for. And so I want to go through and have you explain more fully, if you would, why you said what you did and read it. But before I do that, one last question. Was any of this debated that you know of before this war commenced 3 weeks ago? Did anyone say, well, wait a second, if we do this and kill the Ayatollah, because that was like the first order, I think, what are the effects after? And like, what's the goal? Did these debates ever
I know they happened heavily before the 12-day war. I think that when the Israelis came back around and said they wanted to do this, I just don't think there was any debate. I think just based on the ecosystem and the amount of influence that was exerted.
Because in some ways this is a little humiliating since I was told, the whole country was told that after the 12-day war there was no Iranian nuclear threat. We got rid of it. I'm not imagining that. It just happened.
A few years ago, I decided to solve the way brands work with creators. Back then, working with influencers was a nightmare. I'd hire...
Happened last summer.
Yeah.
Do you recall those statements?
Yeah, I mean, Operation Midnight Hammer.
Yes.
Destroyed their nuclear capability.
So how was it that we wound up 6 months later getting another lecture about their nuclear capability and its imminent threat to the United States and nuclear tip ballistic missiles aimed at Miami and the whole thing, and nobody, first of all, there was no organized protest against this. Like in a normal country, you'd think people would rise up and be like, whoa, 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 whoa. Mm-hmm. You just told us 6 months ago the exact opposite. Yeah. What did internally in the intel world people say, what the hell is going on?
I just think that the planning for this was so compartmentalized that there was no debate, as in it was a foregone conclusion. Maybe the exact timing they weren't exactly aware of, or that had to be debated. When do we do it? But it seemed to be a foregone conclusion. And I'm sure others will say, no, that's not the case at all. But there was no robust debate like there was going into the 12-day war. Because the big question that a lot of us had that were skeptical of Operation Midnight Hammer was, okay, so we do this. We know the Israelis' whole goal is regime change. What makes us think they'll stop? And if they do stop for a period of time, why won't we just be back in the same place in 6 months where they're saying that we have to go back in? And that's essentially exactly what happened.
So this was raised?
This was raised, to my knowledge, in June. This was like, hey, what happens next? So you take out the nuclear, the ability for them to enrich and to potentially develop a nuclear weapon. That's done. We know the Israelis have a completely different goal. Part of that strike, Midnight Hammer, was also to get the Israelis to wrap up the 12-day war. But we knew, because of what the Israelis told us, that this is the time to take down the regime. And they don't want the Ayatollah to be in power. They want a regime change. They want a new government there. So we said, okay, knowing that, we know that this limited strike that we're going to do isn't going to be enough. At some point, the Israelis are going to come back to us and say, hey, we have to go again. And with that knowledge, and I think because so many of us had pointed that out, and because the Israelis had said it, there wasn't a big debate this last time. I think they had that discussion, behind closed doors, and there wasn't a chance for any dissenting voices to come in.
But you would think, well, I've seen it before.